Hey, history scholars. Today we're going to take a look at mercantilism, the Enlightenment, and the Great Awakening. All right, essential questions, things I really want you to know. Number one, what is mercantilism? Two, what was the Enlightenment? Three, what was the Great Awakening? And four, what do all of these events or movements have to do with the colonies and their relationship to England? All right, so essential question number one, what is mercantilism? Mercantilism is an economic policy that is designed to maximize the imports for an economy. So let's go into that a little bit more deeply. So, as we remember, England is facing some major debt after the French and Indian War, plus, England just likes money. And so they established mercantilism. Essentially, they adopted it and enforced a few policies. The first one was that England would sell more goods to the colonies than it would buy from the colonies. All right, so that means that they're making a lot more money than the colonists. The second policy, England would buy raw materials cheaply from the colonies and then sell the colonies' manufactured goods in return. So, in essence, the colonies would provide raw materials at a fairly inexpensive price to England. England would buy them. England would then make them into manufactured goods like hats or whatever they were making. And then England would sell those manufactured goods back to the colonists. And I'm sure at the time, colonists were like, we can make hats, what the heck? So didn't make them very happy. And another policy was that England would prevent the colonies from selling goods to other nations. Again, not very popular with the colonists. So, under mercantilism, it made it difficult for the colonies to acquire the riches that they need in order to purchase manufactured goods. So, if there was really something that the colonists need that they couldn't make, they just didn't have enough financial assets to buy the goods. And so what ended up happening is that merchants and colonists ended up trying to smuggle instead. And the smuggling ring was actually quite successful. Another aspect were the Navigation Acts, or you also will call them the Navigation Laws. So England passed the Navigation Act in 1660, and to be honest, they kind of ignored it for 100 years. And that's what's called salutary neglect. And basically, they had these laws sitting around, they didn't enforce them. And then all of a sudden, when England realized, wow, we have a lot of debt that we have to pay for because of this French and Indian War, they then started to enforce the Navigation Acts. And for those of you that have ever had a parent say, you need to be home by 10, never enforce it. And then all of a sudden, when you get a girlfriend or boyfriend, they enforce it. And you're like, hey, I've had, a long time of just going out with my friends and I'm back when I need to be, but 10 o'clock ain't it. So that's kind of the situation that the colonists are in with England. So things aren't going real smoothly. Under the Navigation Acts, all goods imported or exported from the colonies had to be carried on English ships. And the reason is because England charged very high prices for shipping. Hence, they would make more money. Also, all goods the colonies imported had to come through England first for taxation purposes. And then those goods were reshipped in English ships. So, the colonists really were not happy, and again, the smuggling still continued on because the Navigation Acts were not something that they were going to really abide by after 100 years of salutary neglect. Okay, essential question number 2, what was the Enlightenment? All right, we're backing up, and I'm going to refer to world history quite a bit. So the Enlightenment was actually a movement in Europe that took place in between 1715 and 1789 approximately, and it brought new ideas about the rights of people in relationship to their government. And really, the Enlightenment reached every single English-speaking area of the world. And so it wasn't just special to the colonies. All right, so the Enlightenment, it was heavily influenced by scientific theory. So as you recall in world history, the scientific revolution was something where people were beginning to realize, wow, there's a scientific method that should be followed. We really do need to use rational thought We probably should explain our things and have people check them for us. And so this rational kind of linear thought started to really make an impact worldwide. John Locke, pictured here, love his getup, whatever he's wearing, but John Locke was an Enlightenment thinker who heavily influenced the American belief in self-government. And so John Locke asserted that all people had the natural rights of life, liberty, and property. That sounds kind of familiar. He also believed that people, when they had a relationship with the government, they entered into a social contract with the said government, in that citizens agreed to obey the government and their laws, just as long as the government agreed to uphold their rights, the citizens' rights in return. All right. He was, through this whole process, he was very influenced by the Magna Carta. Magna Carta, if you guys remember from world history, it was established in the 1200s because England's King John, was being a jerk. He was really mistreating people. And so the Magna Carta was established. It was a written document really establishing the rights of people and the role of government. And so the Magna Carta definitely influenced John Locke in his thinking and the Enlightenment. Okay, so Locke also believed if the government violated this contract, that people were justified in overthrowing it. Hence, it really kind of impacted the Declaration of Independence. So, moving on. Okay, so now we're going to focus on the Enlightenment in the Americas. So, as I said, the Enlightenment reached every single English-speaking area of the world. And so some famous colonists influenced by the Enlightenment were Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine. Now, there were others as well, but I wanted to just focus on people in government at this point. So we have Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was a scientist. He was an inventor. He was a fantastic writer, really great speaker. He had all sorts of gifts, and these gifts were very, very based in Enlightenment thinking. You have Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was the third president of our country. He was the author of the Declaration of Independence, and he was also based in major values of the Enlightenment. And then we have Thomas Paine, and Thomas Paine was the author of Common Sense, which was a document circulated among colonists that really got them to think about why separating from England was a good idea. So these three gentlemen, and others as well, were very, very much influenced by the Enlightenment and the theory and the thoughts behind the Enlightenment, such as rational thinking and progress and liberty, were really inspirational to them, and they inspired them to think about separating and creating our own nation based on those values. Okay, so that leads us to essential question number 3. What was the Great Awakening? So, as we just talked about, the Enlightenment was very based on rational thinking and liberty and toleration. And so people started to drift away from church. And so the Great Awakening was kind of an effort to bring people back. So, as defined, the Great Awakening was a response to declining church attendance and Enlightenment ideas. All right, so the Great Awakening. It swept through America in the mid-1700s to restore spiritual intensity. So the Great Awakening was not based on rational thought. It was based on emotion. And so it stressed dependence on God and repentance of sins. The ministers stressed pietism, so individual union with God, having that relationship with God. And colonies held revivals. And so these revivals were often public meetings of preaching and prayer. Many of these preachers, and I'll get into 2 of them specifically in just a second, but these preachers were itinerant preachers, meaning that they traveled all over the place. And sometimes they would give more than one lecture or sermon in a place, and more than one a day. And a lot of the old, preachers that had established churches didn't really want these Great Awakening speakers or preachers to come into their space. And so these preachers would preach often outside and in city, kind of in town halls or outside where a lot of people could gather. And so you have these people that are somewhat new to the religious threshold, basically, and they are called New Lights. New Lights were the people that really brought emotion into things. They eventually became Baptist and Methodist, so they were really the first evangelicals. And then the Old Lights were more the traditional, so more of the Puritan or the Anglican, and more of those traditional types of religious beliefs. Major contributors to the Great Awakening were two specific people. Jonathan Edwards, he was an American preacher, and he wrote the sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And this sermon was all about hell, fire, brimstone. And basically, all of us humans are just tiny little spiders dangling over the great jaws of fire and brimstone and hell's rage, basically. So he used emotion in order to connect with the people listening to his sermon. And yeah, he kind of scared the pants off of people, but he also got them to relate or to connect back to religion. Another person was George Whitefield. George was from Britain. He was from England, but he came to the United States, or to the colonies, in order to travel and to speak. He was one of the best known preachers in really all of Christian history. He gave something like 18,000 sermons in his lifetime. And so that meant that he would travel from place to place, and he just really preached the heck out of, himself. And he really inspired a lot of people. Mostly his sermons were much more positive in comparison to Jonathan Edwards. Okay, the effects of the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening was effective in the South mainly, and that's where we see the rise of Baptists and really of Methodists as well. And if you kind of look around and you know a little bit about religion around the world, there's not a lot of Baptists, except for in the United States, unless you have Baptist missionaries that have gone outside of the United States. So anyway, so many backcountry and tenant farmers converted to the new Baptist faith. So they became New Lights. Baptists welcomed slaves and condemned the brutality of slavery. Okay, a good thing. Planters worried that they would lose control of their slaves, so there was some, concerns as well. But overall, Baptists definitely saw the harm in slavery. The Great Awakening undermined allegiance to traditional authority, and so it called for the separation of church and state, and it ushered in support for colonial independence from Great Britain. So, even though the Great Awakening was a reaction to the Enlightenment, it really also brought in thinking that helped the colonists decide, like, hey, England has really their thumb on us and they're controlling us, and maybe it's not such a good thing. And the Great Awakening did help usher in those types of thoughts that, hey, independence is not a bad thing, and separation of church and state is also not a bad thing. So hopefully that helps you, and it also enables you to think a little bit more clearly about how mercantilism, the Enlightenment, and the Great Awakening influenced colonists and colonists' relationship with England. Thanks, you guys.